My name is David, and I know many of you, but I serve as a lead pastor right here in the Syracuse area, and really not even a year yet. Started January 1st of this year, and so we're going to talk about leading people through change, and it's been a big part of these past 10 months for me is just personal change, but also leading a church through change, and there's some things I've learned along the way, and so I just want to share some thoughts. I hope it's helpful. And looking around this room, there's so much knowledge and insight in this room that I hope to finish in time just to hear the room have a conversation a little bit about change. So I wanted to start by sharing some theological thoughts for you as it relates to change, because I think it's really important that even if we have an understanding of the practice of change and the organizational leadership approach to change, people in your church are going to care about the theological foundation behind change, or at least some people are. And there is a lot of theology that helps us explain the necessity for change and the value of change. And I just want to point out a couple of things. I'm going to look mostly at the Old Testament. The New Testament is very obvious. I mean, the ways in which Paul engages with different audiences, the ways in which he changes his approach so that the gospel can be effectively heard. You could even look at the entirety of the story of Scripture as God transitioning from one covenant to another covenant, or if you're a dispensationalist, from one dispensation to the next, to the next, to the next, wherever we are. But in the Old Testament, there's some really neat things that I've used to help prepare our church for change. And the first one is this idea of the bronze serpent. There's this weird story in the Old Testament in Numbers 21. The Israelites are in the wilderness. They're grumbling again. God sends these fiery serpents, and they begin to attack the Israelites. The Israelites begin to cry out, and God says to Moses, make a bronze serpent, put it on a pole, lift it up, and as people look at it, they will be healed and delivered from these fiery serpents. It's really a beautiful foreshadowing of the gospel, this idea that as we look at Christ, we find life, and the idea that the very thing that plagues us is what Jesus became when he was lifted up on the cross, and it's in looking at him we find life. And so Moses does it, and they're delivered, and they move along. Now, about 800 to 900 years later, this bronze serpent resurfaces in the Old Testament. It's in 2 Kings chapter 18, and a new king has risen to power in Israel, and his name's Hezekiah. And Hezekiah was a good king, and he had to destroy all the altars and all these different things. But one of the things that it says in this text in 2 Kings 18 is that he had to destroy this bronze serpent. And the reason why he had to destroy it is because the people of Israel had begun to worship it. This is one of those little things that doesn't seem like it's maybe very significant, but I don't want to overwork this, but I feel like it's not a stretch to say this. What God asked one leader to build in one generation, he asked another leader in a different generation to break down. And what was a tool of deliverance and freedom and salvation for one people actually became a tool of bondage because they held on to it too long. And they actually began to worship the method that God used to provide deliverance and salvation to them. A lot of our churches are in danger of doing that. We fall in love with the method, and we begin to actually idolize and make sacred things that should not be sacred. And those very things that actually did free us a generation ago could actually hold us in bondage moving forward. Okay, so that's one thought, one theological thought. Here's another one. I did a series a couple years ago through the book of Judges. One of the things that strikes you as you go through Judges is this. Every judge is unique, right? Like, as they go from one judge to the next, they're all very different from each other, which is cool because God's choosing people with different skill sets, with different personality types, with different strengths. You have a prophetess, and then you have a warrior, and then you have a negotiator, and you have all these different types of judges. But right before Gideon, which is one of the most well-known judges, I think, besides Samson, it's the story of Deborah and Barak. So Deborah and Barak is Judges 4 and 5, and then Gideon, I think, is 6, 7, and 8. And I never noticed until I preached them back to back. And here's what I noticed. So Deborah and Barak, which is a story maybe you're not as familiar with. Deborah is a prophetess. She sits under a tree. Israel comes to her for really civil judgment, religious judgment. She's not a warrior, but she knows something has to happen. And so she taps Barak on the shoulder, who is a warrior, and he gets 10,000 men from like 3 of the tribes, and they go and they defeat the enemy. I forget which specific tribe they were fighting. 10,000 men and Barak. And then the Israelites fall back into bondage, and God raises up Gideon. And the Gideon, I believe, is a story where they're being, it's really starvation warfare. The Midianites are coming in, and they're destroying all their crops right after they've grown. And do you remember the story of Gideon, the number of men? He started with 32,000 men, and he ended up with how many? 300. But in between was 10,000. This is a little bit of me conjecturing, but I don't think it's too much of a stretch. When Barak and his 10,000 men won, we know that they sang about it because Judges chapter 5 is a song about it. And in this culture and in this ancient Near Eastern world, they would have sung all over Israel about Barak and his 10,000 men. So my guess, this is again a little bit of a guess, is that Gideon would know that story. Gideon would be familiar, Barak and his 10,000 men. It was a refrain that people probably knew. Maybe people were getting tattooed on their bodies, putting on their bumper stickers, whatever, but super big victory for the Israelites. And I think that when it went from 32,000 men, and Gideon said, if you're afraid, leave, which actually was precedent in the Israeli army. If people were afraid, they were told to not fight. If you're afraid, leave. And Gideon watches 2/3 of the army go, and then Gideon goes, all right, do a head count. How many people do we have? And they come back to Gideon and they say, you have 10,000. Now, this is just me thinking. But I think that at that point, if I'm Gideon, this is what I would think. Oh, this is what I would have thought. Oh, I see what's happening. I see what God's doing. It was Barak and his 10,000 men, and now it's going to be Gideon and his 10,000 men. And almost like, I wonder if Gideon thought, there's a formula to this. This is what it looks like. This is how God provides deliverance for his people. He raises up a leader, and he gives him 10,000 men. So then I think the next one was probably very shocking when they came to Gideon. God came to Gideon and said, you still have too many. And he ends up with 300. And I don't think that when God said to Gideon, you have too many, that he was just challenging his mentality of warfare. I actually think he was challenging Gideon's theology. And I think what he was doing was saying to Gideon, you think that I'm going to do things the same way over and over, but that's not the type of God I am. I'm a God who's always doing something new, doing something different. And then Gideon goes and wins his battle with 300 men. Barak's men actually fought. Gideon's men, if you read the story, they never actually really fought. They yelled out the sword of the Lord and the sword of Gideon, but it was really only the sword of the Midianites that was even used because they all turned on each other. So it's interesting because here's the danger. We fall into this approach to God where we reduce him from a person to a formula. And we have this sort of formulaic approach to God, which really depersonalizes him. And if God is a formula that you can figure out, then you don't need a relationship. You don't need to trust him. You just need to memorize the facts of what he's done in the past and then repeat them. And you really don't need to be dependent upon the Spirit. And as people who are leading churches that are Pentecostal, this is a real strong argument to make for change. Change requires leaders that are hearing what the Spirit is saying and that are sensitive to what the Spirit is doing. And so God has a really unique way in the Old Testament of not repeating himself. Even the whole walk around the walls of Jericho thing, and then Batterson writes his book, Circle Maker, which is, I'm sure, helpful and fine. But one of my thoughts was the Israelites never even did that again. That was literally a one-time trust God, do something crazy, and just trust that you've heard, but don't make it into a formula. And so some of the theological foundation for change is that because we serve a living God, a speaking God, a moving God, we have to be a listening people, or responding people, and a people who know how to lead into change. And John Cotter, I think this quote's at the top of your handout, he literally wrote the book on change. He says, leaders don't make plans, they don't solve problems, they don't even organize people. What leaders really do is prepare organizations, or we could say churches or ministries, for change. And I love this part, and help them cope as they struggle through it. If you're a leader, and all of you are, and I know many of you very well, that's what you do. You are preparing your church for change, and the people in your church for change, and then you're helping them cope as they struggle through the change. Okay? So let's get into some practical thoughts. I have 7 of them for you. And this is not just random thoughts. This is actually in sort of chronological order, the way I think about leading people through change. And the first one is this. Number 1, you have to know the backstory. A lot of times we come in, I'm new in my church, but I've been there for a long time because my dad pastored the church and I worked there for 12 years. And so I have the advantage of knowing a lot of the backstory. But some of you have walked into new churches and you don't know all the backstory. It's very easy to see the things we want to change. Like by nature, I think as leaders we're fixers. And so we see things and we know that's not best practice, we know that's ineffective, we know that's not working, but we don't know the backstory. We don't know why it's there. We don't know really did it ever work. And so when you're going to change something, the first step I think is you got to know the backstory. You need to know as many details as possible about what the thing is that you're going to change. How do you do this? Well, it starts by asking questions, asking more questions than you're giving answers. Get people telling stories. So if there's a program that you're thinking about changing or eliminating, you should ask people who are part of it, hey, tell me what this was like in its heyday. Or tell me what you love about this. Or describe for me the perfect night in this ministry. When's the last time you left this ministry gathering and felt great about it? What was it like? Get them telling stories, and as they're telling stories, what you're doing is you're listening for values. Okay, what do they really value? So if somebody says, well, what I really loved about this ministry is that we used to all get around each other and pray in tongues super loud until we all were like screaming and hugging and crying with each other, then you realize, okay, so they value this like high energy, spiritual, sort of mystical moment. Like that really matters to them. Or maybe what they'll say is, well, what I really valued was just the fact that people knew who I was, and it was a place to be known. Well, now you know they value community. And so what you do is you listen for values. You can begin internally think, do I align with that value? Do I agree with that value? And if you do, it's going to provide a platform for change. To be able to say, I value that also, and here's how we're going to try and accomplish that value. Listen to some of the outcomes that they loved about it and how you agree and align with it and the things that you can affirm. The whole idea with knowing the backstory is this. Don't be an ignorant jerk. Like, don't come in like, I got my degree in leadership and I read all these books and I listen to all these podcasts and I know what church is supposed to look like. Don't be that person. I was so challenged a couple weeks ago when James Bradford was speaking at our leadership summit in Rochester, and he basically said this might not be the exact same words, but he said, the church is Jesus' treasure. Jesus gave himself, right? Gave himself for the church. Jesus loves the church. It's his bride. The church is Jesus' treasure, and he's just looking for other people who will love his church too. And it's simple, but it's so easy to forget. In the mechanics of running a good church and putting together a good service and creating good systems, and I'm all for that. Like, I geek out on that stuff. That stuff's super important to me. It's so easy to forget, like, Jesus just loves these people. He loves his church, and he's just asking me, will you feed my sheep? Like, will you tend to them? Will you shepherd them? Will you care for them? And if you come in just like you don't care about the backstory, you don't care about what it meant to Sister so-and-so 20 years ago, I'm not saying that stuff has to handcuff you. I'm just saying you should know it. You should take your time to hear those stories. There is a story, and there is real significance behind every single thing you are trying to change. It does exist. And what this requires of you, by the way, is it requires you to slow down, because you can change a lot faster if you don't waste time knowing the backstory. It requires you to position yourself as a learner. It requires humility. Okay. Number 2, diagnose the problem. A lot of people try to solve problems before they've actually accurately diagnosed them. Again, this is lots of asking questions, lots of listening, lots of challenging assumptions. Here are some of the questions that I'm asking about things when I'm looking at changing them. What is the current metric for success with this thing? So how do you currently know this thing is winning? Is it succeeding by that metric? So some people say, well, we know it's great because people are showing up. Okay, are people still showing up? Right. So by the current metric, is it succeeding? A lot of things maybe are, some things aren't. But then the next question you have to ask is this: is that even the right metric? Is that what you should be measuring? Another question you want to ask as you're diagnosing a problem is this, and I'm speaking specifically, I guess, at this point of like programs. Is this a value issue or is it a vehicle issue, right? Because there's values and there's vehicles, and when you get them confused, it's really difficult to make change. Values are like, here's the things that we care most about. So one of the things that I value is people knowing the scriptures. Now, there's countless number of vehicles to sort of move that value forward, right? And for years, what did churches use for years to try to raise biblical literacy? Most churches. Sunday school, right? Bible quiz. Yeah, easy, easy. But yeah, Bible quiz and Sunday school. So here's what you need to ask yourself. The thing that I'm looking to change, is this a value issue or is this a vehicle issue? It's a value issue, then the change is more swift, I think. And the change is, you can make the change with more confidence. If it's just a vehicle issue, then you need to begin to ask questions like, what's the best way to accomplish the value that this vehicle is no longer really moving forward well? Ask questions like, why isn't this succeeding? Did it ever succeed? Toyota, they introduced this thing years ago where they talk about asking the question why 5 times. Anytime you're going to diagnose something, the company, the car company, Toyota, they say, until you've answered the question why 5 times, you don't actually know what the issue is. And it's not 5 disconnected questions. So let's say the first question is, how come Royal Rangers doesn't work? What's the issue with Royal Rangers? Nobody's showing up anymore. Why is nobody showing up anymore? Because it's not very good, I don't think. Why isn't it very good? Because we don't have the leaders to make it good. Why don't we have the leaders to make it good? Because, you see what I'm saying? You keep following up all the questions with a series of why questions, keep pushing in, pushing in. A lot of times, because leaders already assume they understand the problem, they don't do that. They just get the first batch of information and they run with it. Listen to people around you. Listen to people who view the problem differently than you. There's a book out there right now called Dream Teams by a guy named Shane Snow. I was listening to a podcast with him recently. And you guys know the old saying, 2 heads are better than 1? You've heard that before? He says it's garbage. And he says research shows that it's garbage. 2 heads are not necessarily better than 1. 2 heads are only better than 1 when there's cognitive diversity, when they think differently, when they see things differently. And here's what he says. If you get 5 people in the room around a problem who all feel basically the same way about it, and all are coming from the same basic position, then that room is only as smart as the smartest person in the room. And it's no better than that. And what he really makes the case for is, as you build your teams around you, you need to intentionally build teams where there's cognitive diversity. And that's his phrase. I don't know if he made that up or got it from somewhere else. But I think we have to pay attention to who are we going to talk through our ideas, our change. Look around your staff. Look around your room. Do you all always feel the same way about everything? That might feel like that's a good thing. It probably isn't. There's got to be someone in the room who every now and then is the irritant, who says, I don't really see it that way. Part of the research behind this, by the way, is they studied detectives who work together to solve crimes, and they asked the question, which pairing is the most effective pairing at crime solving? And across the board, they found that it was when there was more diversity. And the most effective pairing, by the way, for detectives to solve a crime was when a man and a woman were working together, because they just brought distinct perspectives to the same issue. And so the idea that we can diagnose by ourselves, or that we can diagnose just with a room full of people who think like us, it doesn't seem to prove itself out in the research. Another thing about diagnosing is this. Diagnosing what needs to change is only step 1, and it's actually the easiest step, I think. The harder questions we have to ask is this. There's 4 more questions you have to ask when you want to diagnose change beyond what needs to change. Number 2 would be, why does it need to change? And you need to know that, and you need to wrap language around it, and you need to be consistent with it, and you got to stick with it. And it's got to be compelling, and it's got to be attached to your vision and your values. The third question you should ask is this: how are we going to change it? This is strategy. This is actually one of my biggest weaknesses as a leader. I can see change. I can put language behind it. I'm not the best at thinking through strategy about how we're going to pull this off. But that's an important step. You need a strategy. Another question you have to ask is this: who is most affected by this change? And we'll get to it in a second, but that's going to inform the way you roll it out, the conversations that you have, right? The people that you meet with. And then the last question that you have to ask is this: when? When is the right time for this change? Because, and I truly believe this, the right decision at the wrong time is the wrong decision. And if you're like me, as soon as you know something needs to change, you want to change it yesterday. And so it requires us to slow down every now and then and say, there is a right time for this change, and it may not be as quick as I want it to be. When you don't diagnose problems well, here's what you'll do. You will artificially import solutions from other contexts into yours. You'll run off to a conference, and you'll hear about a new way to do small groups, and you'll go, it's working there, I bet it's going to work here. That's one of the clearest indicators that you're not taking the time to diagnose the problems in your own context, is that you're super eager to grab solutions from other contexts and just artificially insert them into your context. Okay, next practical thing here is own the struggle. So know the backstory, diagnose the problem, own the struggle. Up front, you have to own the struggle that change is hard. It's hard for you. It's hard for your people. Reinhold Heifetz, in his book Adaptive Leadership, which is one of the best books, I think, on change, he says, I love this definition of leadership. Not super inspiring, but I think it's true. Leadership is the art of failing people's expectations at a rate they can handle. Leadership is the art at failing people's expectations at a rate they can absorb or they can handle. And every single bit of that definition is important. So, historically, people look to leaders to lead them into victory, whether it's on the battlefield, whether it's as a society. Still, in sports today, we look for our leaders to lead us to victory, right? But the problem is that change, and we'll talk about this in the next point, change feels like loss. So you have leaders leading you into loss is very disorienting for people, because they think, wait a minute, leaders are supposed to help me win. And by changing, you're actually causing me to lose. And so Heifetz talks about this adaptive style of change, which is very important to recognize. You're failing people's expectations, but what's the rate at which they can handle it? And it requires you to pay attention to people. You have to say up front, change is hard. It's hard work. It's hard on people. You're leading people into loss. And say up front, just own up and say, some of this change we're going to do is going to be difficult for all of us. It just is. No one wants to follow a leader whose head is in the sand. And just is like in this dreamland where it's like, no, this is going to be amazing. We want to cast vision, we want to raise excitement, we want to do all that, but you got to own up to the fact and say the journey is not going to be easy. I sent a mass email out this past week to our worship ministry to say, here's some big changes coming next year. And I said right in there, there's going to be some short-term benefits or immediate benefits, and there's going to be some long-term benefits. And the journey between the two is going to be challenging. I just wanted to own it up front. This is going to be really difficult for some of you. The learning curve is significant. Some of you are going to have to stop doing things you've been doing and start doing new things. And I just wanted to say up front, this is going to be hard. So own the struggle. Understand that people are anxious really about learning new things, right? So you have to lower their learning anxiety by letting them know good communication, clear next steps, training. Right? You've heard it said before, the two things that frustrate volunteers the most is, number one, not having clarity about what they're being asked to do, and number two, not having the tools to do what they're being asked to do. Right? So if you're telling people things are about to change, you better have a lot of clarity on what's going to change and how it's going to affect them, but you also need to affirm there's resources, there's training, there's support, there's grace, there's time, we're going to get through this, but it's going to be challenging. You're not just owning the struggle that other people are going to feel, but the truth is I think you have to own your own struggle. Because here's what happens when you lead people through change. You're going to be misunderstood. You're going to be criticized. People aren't going to like it. You guys have seen the change curve. Only 20% of your people are excited about change. And even those people hate change when their OS system updates on their phone, right? So only 20% of people like change. 20% of people are never going to change with you. The middle of that, they're going to kind of watch and see how it goes. But people are going to resist change. If you're leading for the approval of people instead of from the approval of God, you're really going to struggle with change. You're not going to have the backbone. Or your backbone is actually going to be harshness. It's going to appear to be backbone, but it's actually insecurity, manifesting itself as a bully. You're going to demand your way. You're going to demand people get on board or get out. You're just not going to lead in a way that is very Christ-centered. And it really requires a lot of gospel, obviously centered living and confidence. And one thing you have to understand, I was talking with Dan about this earlier this week, and then I wrote this down after this conversation with him. You have to understand two things. Number one, not everyone is coming with you, right? I hate the way of saying this, but I've heard people say this, you choose who you lose. I hate that because I don't want to lose anybody, but you kind of do, right? Not everyone is coming with you. And I told my church board From the day I came in, I said, I just want you to know, not everybody is going to survive these next couple of years. And actually, some of them may struggle with it, right? The board sometimes is, the leaders are the ones that struggle the most sometimes. But the reason why I was prepping them for that is because if you don't prep them for it, when it happens, it's going to be jarring anyway, but it's so extra jarring when you haven't been prepping them all along the way. Not everyone's going to make this journey with us. It just isn't going to happen. There's so many wonderful churches in Syracuse, and all the difficult people we're going to just point them right over to North Central and say, we just bless you, Pastor Dan, with these people, because I know you're doing the same to us. But not everyone is going to come with you. And number two, and this is what I learned listening to Dan the other day, silence and compliance is not the same as agreement.
Absolutely.
With leaders, it should be. This is a big thing for me. When leaders sit in a room and they're silent, to me, that's always agreement. Because if you're a leader and you're not saying anything and you disagree, that's a you problem. You should be saying something. If I leave a room full of leaders and they haven't said anything, I'm going to move forward like that's agreement. But that's not true with the people that you're leading in the church. Silence is not agreement. Silence might just be biding their time. And compliance is not agreement either. It might just be, I'm not going to rock the boat. But, and part of what we're talking about, I won't tell your story, is people may just be sort of keeping score over a series of years. And then when it really is time to say something, you're going to be amazed what they actually remember, and what they actually have to say. And a lot of this can be not, you can't cut this off, but maybe you can get out in front of it a little bit by owning up front. This is going to be difficult for you and for me. I remember when we stopped doing Sunday night services, we were a church that was still doing Sunday night services up until the end of last year. I know we were one of the few. And right away I knew, this is a duplicate of everything else we're doing. This is not the most effective way to do this. But my last Sunday night service, and I was emotional. Because I was the one that wanted to change. And then I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, man, for the last 30 years of my life, what has this time slot meant for me personally? I could point to Sunday night services where, I felt like God spoke to my heart, and times where I was at the altar, and I was surprised by my own struggle with change. It's great on paper, but sometimes when you start to put it into practice, you realize this is hard. This is hard. Okay. The next one is this: you got to name the loss. And Heifetz in the same book says this: people don't resist change; they resist loss. You need to understand the loss that people are going to feel. And so this, again, requires a lot of conversations with people as far as, what are your concerns about this? What do you think, what is it that you value that think will be lost in the process? Sometimes the loss is perceived. You still have to treat it with respect, right? Sometimes the loss is real. There are things that are going to be lost in change. So what do? We need to know it. We need to be able to articulate what they feel like they're going to lose as well as they can, right? So if you just sort of dismiss or mock or ignore what people think they're going to lose, you're never going to bring them along with you, and I don't think you're also leading in a very gracious way. So you need to have enough of a conversation to be able to say back to them, here's what I think, this is what it sounds like. You're afraid that we're going to lose this. You're afraid that this is going to get lost in the process. So when we go to two services, what you really are afraid of is that we're not going to love each other anymore. You're not going to be known. People aren't going to know your name. You're going to feel disconnected. You need to say it so well that they say back to you, exactly. That's what I'm afraid of. Okay, so you need to articulate it. Then, and only then, can you actually address it and affirm one of two things. Yes, that is something we may lose, and help me with this. Or you can affirm, we're going to work really hard. We have ideas on other ways to accomplish that. We're going to do a lot of things to make sure that doesn't happen. And I want you to be a part of us moving forward with that. You have to be able to do that, name the loss. And then, of course, frame what they think they're losing against the greater good and the greater gain of what we're all going to get, right? That's a big part of leadership, is getting people from here to there. And two things that you have to do if you're the senior leader is you have to be able to define here. Max Dupree says the first task of leadership is defining reality. You got to define here, but then you also have to be able to describe there. That's vision casting. We're going from here to there. And all the things that you think we're going to lose here, look at what's going to be there. That's part of naming the loss. Okay, the next thing is you have to connect the dots. And I'm going to move quick here with these last couple. 4 things to connect change to always. Number 1, connect it to your vision. Change always has to be connected to your vision, to your mission. This is the whole Simon Sinek idea. Start with the why. This is where we're going. This is why we're going. This is how you get people to understand the why behind change. Connect it to your vision. Number 2, connect it to your values. In the earlier session with John and Sean, we already talked about this. You say things like this: because we value this, we're going this direction. So 2 of the things that our church values, as generic as they sound, are excellence and empowerment. Excellence simply meaning we do the best we can with all that we have. And empowerment meaning we want the right people in the right seats on the right bus, to borrow that language. And so, as I talked about some of the changes that are going to happen in the music ministry in 2019, I led with this: because we value excellence, because we value empowerment, and because our mission is to make disciples and to create environments that will help us make disciples, here's some of the things we're going to do. And so connecting your change to vision and values. Number 3, connect it to your story. And I think I learned this from listening to Dan too also. The idea that you're not the first person to implement change in your church. You're not the first leader to take a risk. You're not the first person to do something that requires a mentality of what got us here and what get us there. But if you don't know those stories, you can't tell them. And so, when I was talking to our leadership recently about some of the changes coming up at Trinity, I went back to 1996 when my dad bought land in Clay when there was really nothing there. Now it's like this sprawling area with tons and tons of stuff, but he took the risk. And he went out and he saw the land and he listened to what God was saying, and he talked to the leadership, and they spent the money and they bought the land, and the vision that it takes to buy land and to envision what God could do. And so I'm connecting what we're about to do to what we've done in the past. And then eventually, here's what you can say: the same risk-taking, the same willingness to step out, the same visionary leadership, the same ability to endure change that got us here is what we're going to need to get there. And what you're doing for people who've been around the church a long time is you're actually playing on the stories that they love, and you're helping them realize it's the same values. It's just manifesting in a new season and a new time. So connect it to your story. And then another thing with connecting the dots, connect it to more change. Here's one of the things I learned about change. There's a domino opportunity with change, and you can't miss it. There's certain changes that require other changes. And here's what I've learned. If you can make a popular change knock over the domino of some unpopular changes, when people ask you about the unpopular change, you can always go back to the popular change. So I'll give you an example from our church. The design and the decor of the sanctuary was pretty cluttered. Lots of stuff up front, American flag, Christian flag, banners, stuff, just lots of stuff everywhere. What's that? Rainbow flag. No, that's North Central. Yeah. But lots of stuff up there. And I mean, if you're like me, you probably would look at that and go, okay, that probably should change. I knew that was a little challenging because there's some nostalgia attached to some of that stuff, right? And there's some strong feelings attached to the things like, obviously, the American flag, for good reasons. And so, but at the same time, we really needed to change how we projected stuff. And so that was a really popular thing, to go away from like this big screen on the wall sort of deal to like these really large, like 80-inch televisions that everything looks really, everybody loved that because it just looked great. But once we did that, I knew that was going to knock over other dominoes, because literally some of those banners just can't be there once those TVs are there, because you won't be able to see the TVs anymore, right? So it allowed me, and then as we began to paint and redo all the decor, we were able to say, we're redoing the decor of the entire sanctuary. Everybody walks in like, oh, new light fixtures, oh, the paint is amazing, oh, this, that, and the other. And they're more sort of excited with that than they are overwhelmed by the fact of, hey, where'd that banner go? Where's the American flag? Now, you're still going to have those conversations, and I have. Actually, I just, this past Wednesday night, had someone ask me about the American flag that hasn't been on stage for 8 months. Just this past Wednesday night. Pastor Dave, quick question. Where's the American flag? I'm like, where have you been for 8 months? Like, it hasn't been up there. And in that moment, and I'll talk about this in the next one, you need to know what your language is around that, by the way, and you need to be sharp on it, and you need to be consistent with it. Okay, 2 more, and then we'll open it up. Watch your mouth, which is basically watch your language. Language matters so much with change. And this is my sweet spot. I love language. I love crafting stuff. I love putting thoughts together. If there's a weakness of yours, find somebody who can help you on your team put together the right language. Even the way you talk about change. Don't use words like eliminate, kill, do away with. So when we stop doing Sunday night services, this is the way we talked about it. Hey, we're going to repurpose Sunday evenings. So it's kind of a warm word. It sounds exciting. It was true. I mean, don't say things that aren't true. It was true. But instead of saying we're going to stop doing Sunday nights, we said, hey, we're going to repurpose Sunday nights for a couple of different things that we're really excited about. So your language matters. I know people I don't use it a lot, but people like the word pivot. Have you ever heard that in leadership talk? We're going to pivot from this to this. And I guess it just sort of is more, it sounds better than say we're going to stop doing this and we're going to start doing this, or we're going to shift, or we're going to try this, or we're tweaking this, or we're learning something together. So watch the way that you talk about things. What sort of communication or what sort of method of communication should you use with people? A couple of things to ask yourself. How significant is the change? How much does it impact them? So when I sent that email out to the music ministry team, maybe some of you even felt like, wow, that's a lot of change to communicate via an email, and you're 100% right. But I had already had sit-down conversations with the people who owned that ministry and who it affected the most. So they weren't hearing about it the first time in an email because it affected them the most. They were the most affected by the changes. Most of the people receiving the email, it was important for them to know because it was going to change some things, but it wasn't going to have a lot of impact actually on what they were doing. And so you have to ask yourself, how significant is the change? How much does it impact people? And let that determine how you communicate. How can you least be misunderstood too? The way to be least misunderstood is always in person, where they can see your face, they can hear your tone. Phone calls would be probably next, and emails obviously would be below that, and then texting would be probably below that. But really significant change, make sure you communicate in a way where it's least likely that people are going to misunderstand what you're saying. And then prep people. Don't surprise them, even with small changes. So a couple weeks ago, we decided on Wednesday nights we have a grow class, and we probably have enough people to fill up a third of our sanctuary. But you know what people do? They sat all over the place, the room was packed. It was so frustrating. So I remember Claude talking about, well, if you want to change people's behavior, change your systems. So we changed our systems, and it's very obvious. A lot of churches do this, but we bought those nice big ropes, and we just roped off some seats. And actually, Sigmund was one of the people who I talked to about this, and he gave me great advice. He said, don't put the ropes up next Wednesday. Don't do it right away. Say something. So the very next Wednesday night, I said, hey, I just want you guys to know that one of the things that we really think is important is that we create the best environment for learning and growing together. And so we think that includes us all kind of being in more proximity to each other, and it makes discussion easier, and it just helps me as a communicator. And so starting next week, I already had the ropes. I was eager to use them. I didn't want to go one more week speaking in a room that was scattered everywhere, but I just listened to Sigmund and trusted that, Bob Reeves is smart, so maybe John got some of that too. I said to them, starting next week, you're going to see this. Okay, I just want to prep you all. And so the next week they came in and they had seen it. If it was a bigger change, I might have given them a couple weeks heads up. So prep your people for the change that's coming. Don't surprise them. Change, by the way, has a cumulative effect on people. So you might think, wow, this is such a small change. I don't need to prep people for this. But if you're doing lots of other changes, be careful, because you never know which change is going to be the one that's going to have that cumulative effect where they're going to go, you don't ever tell us about what's coming, right? So you want to always prep people for change. And then ask yourself this too, when you think about who you need to have conversations with. Who practically invested in the thing you're about to change? If you think about knocking out a classroom, who built it? When we redesigned our sanctuary, we had a wooden cross in the back on the front wall, and I immediately knew I want that painted white because the walls were going gray. It wasn't going to look good. And thank God, I was in a conversation where one of the board members said, "Do you know who built that cross?" I was like, "No. Are they still alive?" And they told me who. And as soon as they told me who, I was like, and knowing that person, I was like, I need to have a conversation with them. I need to honor them, and I need to prepare them. Because if that person had walked into a room on a Sunday morning, and the first thing they would have thought was that we had a new cross, because it would have looked so different. But then, so I called them up, and I said this, and I had this conversation with them, and it was all very time sensitive, otherwise I probably would have tried to meet with them. And I said, hey, as you know, we're redesigning the sanctuary, and we love the cross that you made. It's been there forever. We want it to stay there. It's important to us. We think that the way people are best going to see it, and the way it's going to be best a part of our overall decor, is if we actually paint it white. Because against the gray wall, the brown wood is just not going to pop. And it was a little tricky, he wasn't angry, but he was like trying to suggest other things. And I was like, well, this is really we talked to our designer, which is another great thing with change if you have experts to kind of refer to. And so this is really the way that we should go. And at the end, he's like, all right. And then when he walked in the next Sunday, he walked up to me and goes, that looks really great, doesn't it? That really pops. Which is a totally different conversation than one I would have had if I didn't, right? So as you're going to change something, specifically with your facilities, find out who put their sweat into it years ago, and at least give them the decency of a heads up in a conversation. And the last thing is this. When it comes to leading people through change, you have to change or control the scoreboard, which means this. You have to frame failure as learning, because it is. When you're changing things, failure or missteps, it's learning. Mark Batterson, one of their values at their church in D.C. is everything's an experiment. You've probably heard him say that before. We're just trying and we're learning and we're growing, and learning and failing is fine because at least we're learning, right? And then celebrate every step in the right direction and give people the opportunity to celebrate. And here's the other thing. As change begins to work, give all the credit away. Give it all away. Take the blame. Give all the credit away. And it creates so much buy-in, and it sets you up for more change. All right. I know I haven't left you as much time as I had hoped, and I know we started a little later. So I think we're allowed to go till 5:40. So we have 15 minutes, and I would love to hear this. I don't even want questions because I feel like I've talked so much. I'd love to hear what you've learned about change. And try not to be as specific to your church as I've been to mine, just for the sake of time. But what are some principles that you've learned about change that either affirm what you've heard or add to it?
I like you talking about that domino effect of change, and we can actually create what I found by small changes that are insignificant. We can start the dominoes falling before we actually make the change that we want to make. That's going to create other changes. And so simple things like changing my pulpit it took me a year. I instantly hated it when I saw it the very first Sunday. But I changed that one. I changed other things in the sanctuary before I changed that. And so it also, by doing these small, insignificant changes, whether it's to decor or in steps or whatnot, you create a culture of change so that there's this expectation that things aren't staying the same all the time.
Who made the decision about the pulpit? It obviously wasn't you.
I inherited it.
I see. Okay.
When I walked in, I inherited it, and I like what you said about knowing the backstory. The first thing I asked was, did somebody build this?
Yeah.
Because I just know, we had a prayer altar, like a full-blown Catholic prayer altar in our church.
Yeah.
And somebody said to me, hey, that was built by so-and-so, and when they passed away, it was great.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
We're all, I'm lumping myself in with being young. I just turned 40, but we're all pretty young. And so most of the change we're down with. But eventually you're going to lead a church that's going to need to change in ways that don't match your preference. And that's when you really know if you can lead people through change. When you're actually championing change that, Bob Reeves, I heard him say this, if you're going to grow a church, you have to be willing to do two things. Number one, you have to be willing to lead in a way that maybe isn't your natural preferred leadership style. And number two, you're going to have to lead a church that isn't your preference exactly, especially as you get older. Absolutely. And I've heard so many great, wise, older pastors say, I don't care for any of the songs that we sing, but I don't care because I want to build a church that, is accomplishing the mission that God's called it to do in the time in which we find ourselves.
I wanted to affirm kind of what you were saying, because I'm finishing my master's in mental health counseling, and so I noticed that when you're talking about leading people through change, a lot of those skills are similar to the skills that I've learned as practicing with my clients, right? And so a lot of them come in with anxiety because there's a lot of things changing in their life, and so you have to be able to de-escalate them and be like, okay, why do you feel like this change? Where is this coming from? What are the skills that you need to move forward? What are the clear steps that you need? And I feel like this is what you're teaching goes even beyond just changing churches. It goes beyond just decor changes and structural changes within the church. Most of us as pastors, but most of you guys as pastors and executive leaders, you lead people, right? These people are going through life changes and they're coming to you with changes, and so you you can apply these skills even into, as you speak to their own lives and disciple them further. So I don't think that you should put it just in a box where it comes to like structural changes and leading your teams. It also comes to leading your people into becoming better people and to living better and to moving further in your life.
That's good. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. John.
Yeah, one of the things, just to push back a little bit,
Yeah.
because you said it, but then you said how long you've been there, and it's kind of a conundrum, but there's a leadership principle that says don't change anything for a year.
Yeah.
And we all hear that, and it's nonsense.
Yeah, I
You
agree.
have to recognize that a lot of these change things, that they're guidelines, they're not hard rules. Because all the stuff that you've changed so far, you're 10 months into it, dude. Like, you're going totally against that rule. And so you have to be able to prioritize the things that are so detrimental that if you don't change them, you cannot wait for them to be figured out. And so sometimes you have to pull the Band-Aid off quick, and there are certain times, in our context, we were a church revite, and if we didn't change, we were literally closing the doors. We had to do something immediately. And we were given permission to do that because of the context that we were in. And so taking your time is one thing, but taking your time to the detriment of the immediate that needs to change, recognizing that those things are really important, and then also prioritizing the things that you are changing, because you do garner a certain amount of permission from people. And so if you're changing just a bunch of things that really don't matter, when you get to the place where you really want to change something vitally important, you've used up all of your credibility.
That's good.
So recognize that you need to prioritize the things that are really important to change and focus on those things, and those things that can wait, put on the back burner, put them on the back burner.
Yeah, so good. There's so many factors that determine how fast you can change. One of them is crisis level. You come into a church that's at crisis, you're going to be able to change a little faster than a church that actually... The hardest thing is to go into a church that feels like they got it together and try to change. That's really hard to do. My context, which many of you are familiar with, is a little bit unique for a new pastor. I'm able to step on the pedal faster, and that would be actually wise for most people, and it's because of my relational equity of literally being in that church for my entire life. And having been on staff there for 12 years, and then even when I was a DYD, that was my church. That's where I served. I was a volunteer youth worker. I preached regularly. And then just this series of events that put me into the position were very unique. So everything is very contextualized. And then the other thing I'll say is the changes early that I've tried to make have been obvious, easy wins, low-hanging fruit. Nobody is going to complain about things looking, well, that's not true. People will always complain about something. But for the most part, people are excited about a new cafe, new space, better this, better that. I fully recognize the real hard change for me is way ahead of me. Like this year has been, just tweaking, just, but the real work is still very much in front of me. So that's good. That was really good. Thank you. Jeremiah.
I just, as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking back to Claude's conversation earlier about the leadership pipeline and how it begins with our own self-leadership and ends with organizational. And some of what I'm realizing is I've really got to take the first step towards leading change well is identifying and being aware of how I handle change personally in my home, with my kids, with my wife, and even with me. How do I handle the changes in the new year? And then start there with this stuff, and then start to figure out where's my challenge most of these subjects, and then work through that so that organizationally it pays off later.
Yeah. And if you find your identity in the change that you're trying to bring, that's a really difficult place to lead from, right? You're going to find your emotions are all over the place because you can make, we talk about this all the time in our network, you can make anything into an idol, including the change that you want to bring. So you got to really guard your heart.
As I like get deeper into ministry, starting on my current staff this past month, I realized that here's my question: is how do you respond to your higher leaders when it comes to instances where it's like there are guidelines of going about change and bringing new to the area, and I respect those guidelines, and I read and I me recognizing don't go beyond those guidelines because that's not my ground, but in my leader's view it's like no, you violated the guidelines. I'm like no, I'm right here in the guidelines. This is where you told me to dwell. to dwell into, grow into, this is where I can make change. And so what I'm saying, like, how do you respond to your, like, kind of, your leaders who see, you're actually in the guidelines, but they see like what you're doing as like big change, or you're doing too much in the area, when really you're doing what you're supposed to.
Yeah. Well, I would just keep getting clarity, honestly. I would just keep asking for more and more clarity as to even examples, so, okay, so I wouldn't push back because they're defining the terms, right?
Yeah.
So my position would not be to challenge how they define the terms, but just to get more clarity on how they're defining the terms. So, okay, so this was beyond what you expected or what you want. Could you give me some more understanding examples of the sort of change that I have the responsibility and the authority to lead, and make sure that you have from them all as much clear communication as you can get. And in your specific situation, since it sounds like there was an initial challenge there, I would I would communicate a lot on the front end of things. So I would say to my leader, hey, I'm thinking about this. What are your thoughts? So you have a beautiful safety net underneath you right now as someone who's on a staff with other leaders over you, and learn to value that. Like I still have it because I'm in the network, but I have a lot less of it because I'm the lead pastor of a church now, and I miss it, to be honest. Like I miss being able to bump things up and to be able to look down and see a safety net. And now as a lead pastor, I feel the void for sure. So embrace it and just have as many conversations as you can about it. And they'll appreciate I think they'll appreciate your desire to know, and to honor. Other thoughts, things you've learned about change? Jared.
Yeah, I would just point out that, positive change can build like a trust equity almost, which can be really powerful. When you talk about, someone mentioned that you've only been there 10 months, but that you've been able to do quite a bit. And that's because you've had a lot of trust equity within that church because of like you said, the relationships with your parents. And so I think that when we actually show evidence that changes that we're making are actually producing positive results and fruit, then what we do is we build equity of trust with people that then will cause the next change to feel like they're going to be more open to it, they're going to be more open to it. And I think that also we can actually form a culture where change is celebrated. And that we don't just have to look at it as, well, people just need change. Statistically, 80% of people are just going to feel it out, whatever the statistics are, 20, 60, whatever it is. But that we can actually break those statistics and create a culture where change is celebrated, change is happening all the time. And I think that in order to do that, like, we can look at things that, there's the big things that you change, and then there's the things that maybe they could be changing all the time, and people would actually love it. And if we could actually look at those things and begin to just allow it to become part of the culture, then we can actually allow that to be something where it's not pushed against maybe as frequently. And then lastly, I would point out that we can ask the question with change, who needs to be part of the conversation? Because I think sometimes we invite too many people into the conversation, especially as lead pastors, executive pastors. Not to say that you're not, that you're just going to bypass people that don't need to know, but I think you mentioned that earlier. Who are the people, that was a great point you made, like, maybe I need to have a conversation with this person. Maybe with this change with the worship ministry, there's key people I need to kind of have that have buy-in, which is another great thing, because if you have the buy-in from some key people, then when the change gets rolled out, then those people almost serve as like a positive reinforcement to the pushback, so that way when there is the inevitable pushback from people that don't like it, that those people are already on board, and those should be influential people that will kind of help you do the coaching. No, but this is great because of this.
Yeah.
And they've already bought it.
That's really good. I think a couple of thoughts to your third thought and one thought to your first thought. To your third thought, buy-in and also a sense that they've contributed to the process, right? Because people tend to support what they feel like they've helped create. And so allowing them to speak into it and have voice. Oh man, I'm trying to organize my thoughts because as you were talking, I had a bunch. Regarding that last one, as far as, who needs to be in the conversation, I 100% agree. The only thing I would warn people against is if you really want the change to happen in an unhealthy way, you're only going to put people in the room who you already are pretty sure think like you and are going to agree with you. And then there are voices that matter that are not being heard. And I know you're not suggesting that. That's just the other probably end of the spectrum of that. If you go too far to the other side, you might not be hearing what needs to be heard, and then you'll be like out of tune with the people. And then to your first point,
I think sometimes that question will cause you to call the guy that made the cross.
Sure.
Maybe you wouldn't have talked to begin with.
Exactly.
And sometimes maybe it would cause you to not include someone that maybe, we better go talk to, the board, or we better go talk to them. And to just ask the question, who needs to be part of the conversation, doesn't mean that you're trying to cut people out, but it just means that you're being thoughtful about whether that's adding or maybe that you're having too many conversations.
That's good. Do you remember what your first thought was?
Building trust equity.
Oh, yes. It's not just the results of change that build trust equity, it's the way you do the change, right? So like what really builds trust, yes, good results, absolutely. But people want to trust not just what you get out of not just your outcomes, but your process.
Yeah.
So the way that you lead change, the way that you communicate change, your graciousness in change, the way, like we talked about at the end, the way that you own up and take the blame, you give away the credit, those sort of things, that builds a lot of referent power, a lot of trust, and that's really, you're 100% right. That sort of equity is necessary as a leader. Yeah. I think we have time for, let's do these two real quick, if you both can be quick. Go ahead.
One quick thought on the idea of building culture, just the idea of an intentional debrief or feedback loop as the change is being made, making sure that it's clear that we're going to have a time where we measure the successes of this, and you come back to evaluate whether or not we're going to continue the experiment.
Yeah.
Telling people that on the front end is going to help a ton in creating that culture.
Yeah, that's great. Let me.
So this isn't more of like a lead role question, more of somebody who reports to somebody else. What are some ways that you would encourage a leader to initiate change, but the leader that they're in submission to is a little bit more micromanagey and more macro defining their parameters that they can work in?
Feels like a whole nother breakout session. It's a great question. It's a great question. The question was, and I'm repeating it so that somebody in the room smarter than me can speak to it. The question was, how do you lead change when you are leading under a leader who's a little bit of a micromanager? And I've not. Here's my honest answer. I've been blessed to not lead in that environment. I really have, either at Trinity or with the network. And so I don't have a lot of experience. Like I might have some like theoretical thoughts, but I love, and this is a little tricky because we all know who your pastors are. But just like, let's just pretend that you learned this from somebody else. Anybody have a quick thought from me on how to lead change? Mike?
I have a similar situation and the opposite, but I think some of the thoughts I might have are helpful. So I was an executive pastor, and our pastor was a little bit fearful of change in the sense they didn't want to upset people. And so a lot of ideas would go around the table, and then when it would come time to execute, oftentimes they kind of be canned because he just didn't want to raise the tension and answer hard questions. And so he was always fighting that, and he was self-aware of it, but it still kind of caused some struggle to move things forward. So the way that I was kind of helpful, or tried to be helpful, because originally I would be upset and frustrated, like, why are we even having these conversations? You don't want to change anything. Like, let's not even have the conversations if we're not going to do anything. I'm a very fast mover, I'm a very fast changer, I love changing, so I have to kind of deal with that. So I think the only thing that I would say that relates to what you're saying that I was thinking is I took him out to lunch a lot and just asked him to share his vision with me. I asked him to share the whys behind the whats. I try to get a little bit more personal about what are the biggest fears you're having, and how can I help reduce those fears? How can I burden those questions for you? How can we together even form a team that would help articulate that fear. And little by little, he realized he's not doing it by himself. And so those things kind of began to grow a little bit faster. And so I think I won him over in the sense of just teaming up with him instead of making it feel like originally what I did, which was stupid, make it feel like he's the cause of no change in our church. And so I don't know if that's helpful, but that was the experience that I had working through that. It took a couple of years to continuously work through that.
Some things just require time, right? Like longevity, there's no shortcut for that. And that equity, that trust equity, that he can trust your heart and know that you're trying to help him win and succeed. So,
Can I just say something on that
Yeah.
right there? I think as well as just like confronting it, I think that there can be, depending on personality, you can sometimes kind of withdraw, and you can sometimes just like, okay, I'm gonna work under authority, and so you end up just like thinking that you're doing everyone a favor by just saying, well, I'm just working under authority, when really, probably the best thing to do would just be to go direct and just say, listen, I care about what you care about. How can I gain your trust? Kind of like what Mike said. What can I do so that you can see what I value? And this is how you're making me feel when you do this. I feel like when you come in and you just change everything when I've already done this, that you're making me feel like I'm not meeting your expectation. What are your expectations so that I can do that and we both can feel like we're leading together, So I think being direct in that will become easy for some people, and then others it will be challenging. So being able to kind of have some good language in your mind and thinking of what you're going to actually say when you do it is always helpful. But I think that can really help a leader a lot when they're just direct and sometimes just says, "Listen, look, this is what I'm dealing with."
yeah, that's good. If anyone,
Just one last
yeah,
thing.
please go ahead.
I think it's really important to trust your leader.
Yeah.
If you don't trust your leader, you're going to constantly second guess them. If you don't trust their heart, if you don't trust, the minute you start thinking, and I'm not saying this is you, but it does happen, I've been prone to it, the minute I start thinking that I'm smarter than the guy above me, I've already shredded that trust level, and I no longer submit to him the way that I should. And instead of trying to understand their heart and understanding who they are, you have to trust their heart, that their heart is for the people, the heart is for the church, the heart is wanting. Exactly like what Mike was saying, is you have to understand that person's why. Because a lot of times in change that I've led through, there's a lot of information that I have that not everybody else is privileged to. There's a lot of reasoning behind why I did or didn't do something that nobody else knows, and they're frustrated, but if they trust you, it gives you the credibility to say, you may not understand why I'm doing this right now, but just trust my heart that I want the same things that you do. And it's a really sticky situation because it becomes a real issue of pride. And the enemy can use that so easily to begin to twist the screws between a relationship that is meant to be so cohesive and so healthy, that the enemy can use those as footholds. So just being really careful about that and saying, you know what, I don't understand it, you're not moving at the same speed that I would, but I trust you.
Yeah.
And as soon as you lose that, geez, you might want to start looking for another job.
I felt an arrogance brewing inside of me that was so ugly and nasty.
Yeah.
Because I started to feel like, you start saying and thinking stupid things. And
That's great.
that's good.
Man, I really so respect so many people in this room. I wish we spent a lot of time together like this, because I feel like we learn a lot. I'm glad that we